As a quick review, we are knitting an adult sweater that will finish to 46 inches in the chest. At least 4 inches of ease is recommended for this style. We're using a bulky machine or sometimes a mid-gauge machine that will get 4 stitches, 6 rows per inch. In previous videos, we have covered the planning, knitting the back, knitting the front, and adjusting in case your gauge was imperfect and you could not exactly match mine. The diagrams, instructions, and materials we're working with all come from this book, which contains many, many more sizes of the same design and also multiple ways to build on this design. Here's the sleeve we will be knitting. It can be knitted bottom up or top down, but I'm going to demonstrate top down. The reason that I like to do this is that it's easier and quicker to make neat decreases than increases. Working top down also allows us to attach the sleeve to the garment without a seam. It's automatic. Before I actually knit in front of you, let me go through it verbally. We're going to hang the armhole on 84 needle. As we begin knitting, we will also decrease 1 on each side every 4 rows 25 times. Although I rarely use abbreviations, I do use them in the sleeve chart in the Answer Ladies Machine Knitting Notebook because it is such a concise way to fit the information into a chart. And this is how it will look. DEC stands for decrease, E stands for every, R stands for row, 25X means 25 times. Sometimes there's a comma with additional information. For this size, it's comma, then every 3 rows 1 time. Those are still decreases. We'll knit to a total of 106 rows, then work the cuff and bind off to finish. Before we actually knit, you should know that sleeves are an area where 2 people who can wear the same basic sweater might differ enormously in the need for the sleeve length. I am going to do an entire video on making sure the sleeve will fit you or the intended wearer, and what to do if the sleeve as designed is not a great fit. So if you are at all uncertain, please view that video and adjust. In order to knit the sleeve top down and seam it simultaneously to the garment, we hang the armhole edge on the machine. You can see the markers that designated the armhole on the left and right of the picture, shown by the arrows. The simplest way to get the edge evenly hung is to hang the shoulder seam in the center of the designated needle span, the markers on the left and right, and then gradually divide up the space, picking up the middle of the span that's left, hanging it. I'm using a 3-prong tool. You can use 1, 2, or 3, depending on what you're comfortable with, and continue to divide the space and hang on the needles. You'll be surprised how easy it is to tell what's pretty much even. And when the spaces are down to 9 or 10 needles, you can just hang them as they appear. By then, you usually won't make a mistake. I get the best results by hanging the entire edge column of stitches. So my tool is going in right next to that, between the first and second columns of stitches. And that's what I hang on the needles. It's very important that each needle goes through a separate and distinct opening in the knitting. If it's really difficult to get this edge hung in your particular gauge, don't worry about it. You can cast on the desired number of stitches using any tidy cast on and knit from the top down and seam later. In some yarns, there's a noticeable difference in look if you knit from the top down versus the bottom up. It is not really caused by knitting from the top down, it's caused by knitting from the opposite end of the yarn. We can get around that by rewinding the yarn. I rewound this pulling from the center. On my winder, that means that what was originally the center is still the center. But this kind of ball I can knit from the outer edge of it where I could not with the original skein. So I will do that and it'll be fine. Just as occurred when we hung the collar, this makes a relatively thick spot for the machine to knit over. And if you're not absolutely certain that your machine will do it comfortably, hand knit that first row. I don't mean on hand knitting needles, of course. I mean bring the machine needles forward, lay the yarn in the hooks, and pull back. Now begin to knit a few rows and work decreases at the pace called for in the pattern. I recommend the full fashion decrease using a two-prong tool like this one because that will make the eventual seaming much more straightforward. And always remember to decrease on each side. After knitting the first batch of rows, it's a smart idea to stop and check the knitting. As mentioned before, it's super important that each needle enters a unique opening. If two needles entered the same opening, you will get abnormal stitching, basically with ladders in it. The needle will seem to pick up and knit, but it won't make a closed stitch, and you'll have to undo the whole thing. For this sleeve, unless you adjusted it, we decrease every 4 rows 25 times, then every 3 rows 1 time. Continue knitting until row 106 is complete, and that is the end of the sleeve, except for the cuff. The ribbed cuff is what we usually use. Here's the finished sleeve that lacks only the cuff. There is an even number of stitches in work. If you prefer that your ribbing begin and end with a knit stitch, make 1 full fashion decrease on one side only. 12 to 18 rows at main stitch size minus either 2 or 3 whole numbers. This doesn't need waste yarn as we did in the beginning because we have the whole rest of the sleeve to hold on to. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's what it does need, is a little more care taken that we drop to the exact right level. And we'll latch 12 back up. This edge one is the most difficult one in my opinion. It's really second from the edge, of course. But because the edge stitch gives you less to hold on to and tends to get a little bit tighter than the rest, after this it'll be easier. Also, if you get good eyes, you can read across from where you were and put your tool in the correct spot and pull down. I do like to count as I latch up though, just to be sure, because there's nothing worse than getting the whole thing finished and bound off and discovering that you've got slightly different lengths to your ribbing. So you're always torn. Will I notice? Will anybody care? But you do care. Let's see. This looks like the correct one. Let's see how I did. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All the way across like this. Use your favorite bind off, making sure that it's stretchy enough to allow your hand to pass through the cuff, and there it is, the finished sleeve knitted right onto the sweater. Seam the left shoulder seam and neckband. Now make the second sleeve on the other side in exactly the same manner. If your sleeve needs adjustment, watch the next video, change the numbers, but knit it just as shown in this video.